People like you shouldn't even be looking at first class, let alone sitting in it.
You're nothing but a
Jessica
troublemaker!
Martinez's voice cut through Meridian Airlines Flight 847 like a courtroom gavel, sharp and final. She stood over seat 3A, arms crossed, eyes cold as winter steel, speaking loud enough for every passenger in the cabin to hear every calculated word. The man in the navy polo shirt didn't flinch. Terrence Williams, 45, looked up from his phone with the kind of calm that comes from years of practice. His dark jeans were unremarkable. His sneakers showed wear, and nothing
you
about
think
his
you can just
appearance
sit there and
screamed
ignore the
wealth or
rules?
power.
You're
To everyone
nothing but a
watching, he looked like
troublemaker!
exactly what Jessica thought. He was someone who didn't belong. What Jessica didn't know was that in exactly 13 minutes, the man she just humiliated would shut down her entire airline. Before we get into this story, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if moments like this make your blood boil the way they should, hit that subscribe button, because this is about to get intense. It was Tuesday afternoon, 2:30 p.m., and Meridian Airlines Flight 847 sat at the gate in Austin, bound for Chicago. The first-class cabin held 12 passengers, most already settled with their champagne and warm nuts. The atmosphere had been relaxed, almost sleepy, until Jessica's voice shattered the peace. "Sir, I'm going to need to see proof that you actually purchased this ticket." Jessica continued, her tone dripping with suspicion. She was 38 with 15 years of flight experience, and she wore her authority like armor. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it seemed to stretch the disdain across her face. Terrence set down his phone slowly, deliberately. "I'd be happy to show you my confirmation," he said, his voice steady and controlled. There was no anger there, no defensiveness, just a quiet confidence that seemed to irritate Jessica even more. "Because we've had issues with people using fake bookings to access premium seating?" She added loud enough for the businessman in 2B to look up from his laptop and for the woman in 4A to pause her phone conversation. The cabin began to shift. Conversations stopped. Phones appeared. The energy changed from sleepy comfort to electric tension, the kind that happens when people sense they're about to witness something they'll talk about for years. Terrence reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, opening his boarding pass app with the patience of someone who'd been through this before. "Here's my confirmation number, seat assignment, and purchase receipt," he said, holding the screen toward Jessica. She glanced at it for exactly 2 seconds. That could be anything. Anyone can fake a mobile boarding pass these days. A young man in seat 2B had quietly started recording. His name was David Chen, 42, a tech influencer with 2.3 million followers who'd planned to spend the flight editing content. Now he found himself documenting something much more important. "This is interesting," David whispered to his camera, keeping his voice low. "Flight attendant is challenging a passenger's right to sit in first class. This feels wrong already." In seat 4A, Isabella Thompson, a 35-year-old civil rights attorney with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, had stopped her phone call entirely. She'd seen this dance before in courtrooms and depositions. She recognized the pattern, the tone, the way Jessica was building a case based on nothing but assumptions. "Ma'am," Terrence said to Jessica, his voice still calm, still controlled. "I purchased this ticket 3 days ago through your website. The payment went through my corporate credit card. I can show you the email confirmation if that would help." Jessica's jaw tightened. She wasn't getting the reaction she expected. Most people would be flustered by now, apologetic, eager to prove their innocence. Terrence's composure seemed to fuel her suspicion instead of easing it. "Corporate credit card," she repeated, as if the words were foreign. "And what corporation would that be?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Other passengers were openly watching now. The businessman in 2B had paused his typing. The elderly woman in 1D was peering over her reading glasses. Even passengers in the rows behind the first-class curtain had started craning their necks to see what was happening. Terrence studied Jessica's face for a moment, reading something there that made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I work in aviation management," he said simply. "Aviation management?" Jessica repeated her tone, suggesting she found his answer as fake as his supposed boarding pass. How convenient. That's when Brad Coleman appeared. At 31, he was the junior flight attendant, eager to impress his senior colleague and establish his authority. He'd been arranging amenities in the galley when he heard Jessica's voice rise, and he'd practically jogged over to join what looked like a confrontation. "Everything okay here, Jess?" Brad asked, using the familiar nickname to show the passengers he was part of the team, part of the authority structure that was questioning this man's right to be there. "Just verifying a passenger's credentials," Jessica said, her voice taking on a performative quality now that she had an audience of both passengers and crew. "We can't be too careful these days." Brad nodded seriously, as if he were a security expert instead of someone whose main job was handing out peanuts and checking seatbelt compliance. "Absolutely. These premium cabins are for verified customers only. We can't just let anyone sit wherever they want." The words hit the cabin like a slap. David Chen's recording never paused, but his eyes widened. Isabella Thompson set down her phone entirely, her legal instincts fully activated. In the back rows, a Hispanic airline industry reporter named Michael Rodriguez looked up from his magazine, suddenly very interested in what was happening ahead of him. Terrence Williams sat in his seat, taking it all in. The assumptions, the performance, the way two crew members were tag-teaming to make him prove his humanity before he could prove his right to sit down. He'd been here before in different forms, in different places. But this time was different. This time he had the power to make sure it never happened again. "Look," Jessica said, her voice growing harder, more certain. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know when something doesn't add up. And right now, nothing about this situation adds up." She gestured toward Terrence as if he were a puzzle missing crucial pieces. "Designer suit, number expensive watch, gnome. First-class luggage, gnome. But somehow you've got money for a $3,000 ticket." The words hung in the first-class cabin like a challenge thrown down in a duel. Every passenger felt the weight of them, the ugly assumption wrapped in procedural language. David Chen's live stream had started automatically when he began recording, and his viewer count was climbing rapidly as people sensed drama unfolding. 2.3 million followers, and we're about to witness something ugly in real time, David whispered to his camera, angling it to capture both Terrence's calm response and Jessica's increasingly aggressive stance. Terrence had been here before, but never quite like this. At 23, fresh out of college with his first real job at a tech startup, he'd saved for months to buy a business-class ticket home for his mother's birthday. The gate agent in Dallas had looked at his sneakers, his backpack, his young face, and announced that his ticket appeared fraudulent. She'd made him stand aside while she called security, made him watch other passengers board, made him prove his worth in front of strangers who assumed guilt before innocence. He'd missed the flight, missed his mother's birthday, slept in the airport that night because he couldn't afford a hotel after spending everything on the ticket they wouldn't honor. That night, lying on an airport bench, he'd made himself a promise. He'd never be powerless again. He'd never be in a position where someone else's assumptions could determine his fate. He'd build something, own something, become someone who could fight back. 22 years later, sitting in seat 3A on Meridian Flight 847, Terrence Williams owned the airline that employed Jessica Martinez. He owned 67% of the company whose uniform she wore with such pride. He had the power to end her career with a phone call, but he wasn't ready to use it yet. "Ma'am?" he said to Jessica, his voice still level. "I understand your concern about security, but I've provided you with valid identification and a confirmed boarding pass. What specific procedure requires additional verification?" Isabella Thompson, the civil rights attorney in seat 4A, felt her pulse quicken. She'd heard that tone before, calm, measured, legal. The tone of someone who knew exactly what was happening and was building a case. Question by question. The procedure, Jessica snapped, is that I use my judgment to ensure passenger safety and seat integrity. And my judgment says something's wrong here. Brad Coleman nodded enthusiastically beside her like a backup singer to Jessica's lead. We've had issues with people using stolen credit cards, fake identities, all kinds of scams to get into first class. Stolen credit cards, Terrence repeated quietly. Fake identities, he added even quieter. The questions weren't really questions. They were traps, legal snares being set with surgical precision. Isabella recognized the technique from depositions. Make them say the quiet part loud. Make them commit to the discrimination on record. In seat 5B, Kevin Johnson, a 26-year-old medical student, shifted uncomfortably. He was one of only 2 black passengers in first class, and Jessica's words were hitting him like ricochets. Every assumption she made about Terrence was an assumption she might make about him. Every doubt she voiced was a doubt he'd faced himself. Kevin had worked 3 jobs to save money for medical school, sold his car to pay for MCAT prep courses, eaten ramen for months to afford a single first-class ticket home to see his family. Now he was watching another black man be forced to justify his existence in a seat he'd paid for legally. "This is wrong," Kevin said, loud enough for Jessica to hear. "This man doesn't owe you an explanation beyond his ticket and ID." Jessica whirled toward him, her eyes flashing. "Excuse me, passengers don't get to determine airline security protocols, and airline employees don't get to racially profile passengers," Isabella Thompson said from seat 4A, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in courtrooms. The cabin fell silent. The word hung there, racially profile, like a bell that couldn't be unrung. David Chen's camera captured Jessica's face as the color drained from it, captured Brad's mouth opening and closing without sound, captured the moment when subtext became text. That's not what's happening here," Jessica stammered, but her voice had lost its certainty. "This is standard security verification." "Standard for whom?" Isabella asked. "Because I've been watching you for the past 10 minutes and you haven't asked anyone else in first class to verify their credentials. Just him." Michael Rodriguez, the airline industry reporter in seat 1D, had stopped pretending to read his magazine. He was taking notes now, recognizing a story that would write itself. He'd covered airline discrimination cases before, but never witnessed one unfolding live, never seen the moment when assumptions became accusations. Elena Rodriguez, the 29-year-old flight attendant who'd been quietly preparing the cabin service, appeared from the galley. She was newer to the job, still hopeful about customer service, still believing that treating people well was the point of hospitality. She'd heard the raised voices and come to see if she could help. "Is there a problem here?" Elena asked, her tone genuinely concerned rather than confrontational. "No problem," Jessica said quickly. "Just verifying passenger credentials." But Elena had heard enough to understand what was really happening. She'd seen Jessica challenge passengers before, had noticed patterns she didn't like but hadn't felt senior enough to address. Now, watching a calm, well-dressed man be treated like a suspect for no visible reason, she felt her conscience engage. Sir Elena said to Terrence, "May I see your boarding pass? I can verify it in our registration." Terrence handed over his phone and Elena scanned the QR code with her device. The system chimed immediately, verified, confirmed first-class seat 3A, Terrence Williams, frequent flyer status, Platinum Elite. "His ticket is completely valid," Elena announced. "Purchased 3 days ago, confirmed this morning. No flags or concerns in the file." Jessica's face flushed red. "I didn't ask for your help," she snapped at Elena. "I'm handling this verification." "But the verification is complete," Elena said, confused. "His ticket is legitimate. There's nothing more to verify." Brad Coleman stepped closer to Elena, trying to assert the hierarchy. "Jessica is the lead flight attendant. We follow her protocols." Even when they're wrong, Elena asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The question hit the cabin like lightning. Passengers leaned forward. David Chen's viewer count jumped past 50,000 as word spread through social media that something significant was happening on a live stream. Terrence Williams sat in his seat watching it all unfold. Watching Elena find her courage, watching Isabella build her case, watching Kevin defend a stranger, watching David document the truth. He'd been the catalyst, but the reaction was bigger than him now. It was about every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong, every assumption made based on appearance, every time someone had been asked to prove their humanity before claiming their rights. Jessica Martinez was about to learn that some assumptions carry a price, and that price was about to come due. "Ma'am," Terrence said to Jessica, his voice still calm but carrying new weight. "I want you to think very carefully about what you say next, because in about 10 minutes you're going to wish you could take it back." "Are you threatening me?" Jessica asked, her voice rising to a pitch that carried to the back of the plane. "Because threatening crew members is a federal offense." David Chen nearly dropped his phone. In the span of 30 seconds, he'd watched a flight attendant accuse a passenger of theft, racial profiling, and now terrorism. His live stream viewer count was exploding, 75,000 people watching in real time as a woman destroyed her own career with surgical precision. "Chat is going insane," David whispered to his camera. 75K viewers and climbing. People are demanding answers. Someone just donated $50 with the message, "Make this go viral." I think it already has. The notification sounds from phones throughout the cabin were constant now. Passengers were sharing clips, tagging friends, posting to Instagram stories with captions like, "Watching discrimination happen live, and this is why we need cameras everywhere." Terrence pulled out his phone and sent a single text message. Code yellow. 3 blocks away in a downtown Austin office building, Rachel Anderson was having a mundane Tuesday afternoon when her phone buzzed with the message that changed everything. As Terrence's executive assistant and crisis manager, she knew the code system. Yellow meant prepare for media attention. Orange meant prepare for legal action. Red meant all hands on deck. She immediately opened the Meridian Airlines social media monitoring dashboard and felt her stomach drop. The hashtag Meridian Airlines was trending upward fast, and every mention was negative. Videos were spreading across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook faster than she could track them. "Flight 847, she whispered, pulling up the passenger manifest. When she saw Terrence's name in seat 3A, her blood went cold. Isabella Thompson had her legal notepad out now, writing down everything she heard verbatim. She'd prosecuted discrimination cases for 8 years, but she'd never had the luxury of watching the evidence create itself in real time. "This is unprecedented documentation," she murmured to the passenger next to her. Usually we're reconstructing conversations from memory months later. Here we have multiple video angles, real-time witness testimony, and a paper trail being created as we speak. Michael Rodriguez was texting his editorial team at Aviation Weekly with updates every 30 seconds. Flight attendant questioning black passenger's right to first-class seat. Passenger provided valid ID and boarding pass still being challenged. Other passengers confirming discriminatory treatment. Story going viral on social media in real time. His editor texted back, "Keep documenting. This is front-page material." Jessica seemed oblivious to the digital wildfire spreading around her. She was locked in a power struggle with a man who appeared to have no power at all, so focused on winning that she couldn't see she'd already lost. "I don't care how many people are filming," Jessica declared, her voice carrying across the cabin. "This is my aircraft, and I decide who sits where based on legitimate verification procedures." "Your aircraft?" Terrence asked quietly. The question was so simple, so gentle, that several passengers leaned forward to hear Jessica's answer. As the senior flight attendant, "Yes, I have authority over passenger seating and compliance," she said, confidence returning to her voice. She was on familiar ground now, citing procedures she'd memorized. Elena Rodriguez watched from the galley, her heart sinking. She'd tried to de-escalate, tried to show that the passenger was legitimate, but Jessica was too invested in being right to accept being wrong. Elena had worked for Meridian Airlines for only 8 months, but she'd never seen a senior colleague dig such a deep hole for herself. Kevin Johnson, the medical student, was live tweeting the incident with clinical precision. Minute 15. Flight attendant continues challenging passenger despite valid verification. Passenger remains calm. FA becoming increasingly aggressive. Other passengers documenting everything. This is bigger than one incident. His followers were retweeting faster than he could type, adding their own commentary about similar experiences with airline discrimination. David Chen's live stream had reached 150,000 viewers, and the comments were a mix of outrage and legal advice. Someone get this passenger a lawyer. This is textbook discrimination. That flight attendant just ended her career. Plot twist. What if he owns the airline? The last comment made David pause. He looked at Terrence more carefully, the quality of his clothes despite their casual appearance. The expensive phone, the absolute calm in the face of harassment. There was something there, something the flight attendant was missing. "Guys," David whispered to his camera, "I think there's more to this story than we're seeing. This passenger isn't reacting like someone who's afraid of getting caught. He's reacting like someone who's in control." Terrence sent his second text, code orange. Rachel Anderson's phone buzzed again, and she knew the situation had escalated. Orange meant prepare for legal action. She immediately conference called Amanda Foster, the board chair, and Luis Ramirez, the chief operating officer. "We have a problem," Rachel said without preamble. "Terrence is being racially profiled on one of our flights, and it's going viral." There was silence on the call. Then Amanda Foster's voice, tight with concern. "How viral trending on 4 platforms. Multiple live streams. Aviation media covering it. And it's only been 20 minutes. Luis Ramirez spoke next. "Where's the flight?" "Still at the gate in Austin. Flight 847 to Chicago." "Jesus," Amanda whispered. "Get me the crew roster. I need to know who we're dealing with." Back on the plane, Brad Coleman decided this was his moment to shine. "Ma'am," he said to Jessica, "maybe we should call security. If this passenger won't comply with verification procedures." "Security?" Terrence asked, and there was something new in his voice. Not fear, not anger, but something sharper. "For sitting in a seat I purchased for refusing to comply with crew instructions," Brad said, puffing up with borrowed authority. Isabella Thompson stood up. "As a civil rights attorney, I'm advising everyone in this cabin that what you're witnessing is federal discrimination. Document everything. These videos will be evidence." The cabin erupted in phone camera flashes and notification sounds. Passengers who'd been passive observers became active documentarians, understanding they were witnessing history being made. Jessica Martinez had started the day thinking she was protecting her airline's first-class cabin from an unwanted intruder. Instead, she'd turned it into the most documented discrimination case in aviation history. And Terrence Williams hadn't even revealed who he really was yet. Captain Sandra Foster's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay due to a passenger service issue. We'll have you in the air shortly." The announcement was standard airline speak, but every passenger in first class knew exactly what passenger service issue meant. They were watching it unfold in real time. "Passenger service issue," David Chen repeated to his camera. His viewer count now approaching 200,000. That's what they're calling racial profiling now. Orwellian language at its finest. Jessica's radio chirped, and Captain Foster's voice came through loud enough for nearby passengers to hear Jessica. "What's the situation up there? Ground control is asking about our delay." Jessica keyed her radio, her voice taking on a professional tone that contrasted sharply with her aggressive passenger interactions. "Minor verification issue. Captain, should be resolved shortly." Verification of what Foster's voice crackled back. Passenger credentials for seat 3A. There was a pause before Foster responded. The passenger has a boarding pass. Yes, but... And valid identification. Jessica hesitated. Yes. But the circumstances seem irregular. Irregular how? The question hung in the air. Jessica looked around the cabin, suddenly aware that every passenger was listening to her explain herself to her captain. She could see phones pointed at her, could feel the weight of judgment from seats that should have been deferential. The passenger doesn't fit the typical demographic for first-class service. The words fell into the cabin like stones into still water, creating ripples that reached every corner. David Chen's live stream exploded with comments. Isabella Thompson wrote furiously in her legal pad. Michael Rodriguez's fingers flew across his phone, updating his editorial team. Kevin Johnson felt his stomach twist. Doesn't fit the demographic. There it was, the quiet part said loud, the assumption made explicit. He'd heard variations of that phrase his entire life in scholarship interviews and job applications and every situation where his presence seemed to surprise people. Elena Rodriguez closed her eyes. She'd known this was wrong from the beginning, but now it was impossible to pretend otherwise. Jessica had just admitted on a recorded radio frequency that she was challenging a passenger based on his race. Captain Sandra Foster's voice returned sharper now. Jessica, bring the passenger manifest to the cockpit. Now, Captain, I can handle this. Now, Jessica. Terrence watched Jessica's face as she realized her captain was calling her to account. 23 years ago, a gate agent had hidden behind procedure and policy to humiliate him. Now he was watching the same playbook get dismantled by a captain who understood the legal implications of what she'd just heard. Sir Elena said to Terrence, I apologize for this situation. Your ticket is valid, your seat is confirmed, and you have every right to be here. Jessica whirled on Elena. You don't speak for this crew. Someone should. Elena replied, her voice stronger than before. Because what's happening here is wrong, and everyone knows it. Brad Coleman stepped between them, his voice tight. Elena, you're out of line. Am I? Elena asked. Or am I the only one thinking about what this looks like? What it is? Security Supervisor Carlos Mendez appeared at the cabin entrance, his presence immediately shifting the energy. At 39, he'd worked airport security for 15 years and had a sixth sense for situations about to explode. The tension in the first-class cabin was so thick he could feel it from the doorway. Someone called for security assistance? Carlos asked, his voice calm and professional. Yes, Jessica said quickly, relief flooding her voice. We have a passenger refusing to comply with verification procedures. Carlos looked at Terrence, who was sitting calmly in his seat, hands folded, making no aggressive moves or statements. Then he looked at the phones pointed in every direction, the passengers clearly recording everything, the flight attendant whose professional composure was cracking under pressure. What specific verification is required? Carlos asked Jessica. Proof of legitimate ticket purchase. Carlos looked at Elena. Has the ticket been verified in your registration? Yes, sir. Valid purchase, confirmed seat assignment, frequent flyer, platinum status. Carlos nodded slowly. He'd seen this before, crew members making problems where none existed, usually because of unconscious bias they couldn't recognize in themselves. Ma'am, he said to Jessica, if the ticket is verified in your registration, what additional verification is needed? Jessica's face flushed. I have the authority to use my judgment about passenger compliance. Your judgment about what specifically? The question was gentle but pointed. Carlos was giving Jessica a chance to articulate a legitimate concern, or admit she didn't have one, about whether the passenger legitimately belongs in first class. The words hung in the air like a confession. Carlos had heard enough. He'd been a security supervisor long enough to recognize discrimination when he heard it, and he'd been through enough legal training to know that Jessica had just created a federal case. Terrence pulled out his phone and sent his third text of the day, code red. Rachel Anderson's phone buzzed, and she felt her world shift. Code red meant full authority activation. It meant Terrence was about to reveal his identity. It meant everything was about to change. She immediately called Amanda Foster. Code red. "He's going full disclosure." "Christ," Amanda whispered. "Get legal on the line, and get me a direct connection to Flight 847. David Chen's livestream had reached 400,000 viewers with sharing rates that were breaking his personal records. Aviation journalists were joining the stream. Legal experts were commenting. Civil rights organizations were taking screenshots for evidence. "This is unreal," David whispered to his camera. "500,000 people are watching a flight attendant destroy her career in real time. But I think the plot twist is coming. This passenger is too calm, too controlled. There's something we don't know yet." Isabella Thompson had filled 4 pages of her legal pad with direct quotes, timestamps, and witness observations. As a civil rights attorney, she'd never had such thorough documentation of discrimination as it happened. Captain Foster's voice crackled over Jessica's radio again. "Jessica, report to the cockpit immediately. Bring the passenger manifest." Jessica keyed her radio one more time. "Captain, if I could just finish resolving this passenger situation." "The passenger situation is resolved." Foster's voice cut through her protest. "Report to the cockpit now." Carlos Mendez looked at Terrence, his security instincts fully engaged. Something about this situation wasn't adding up. The passenger was too calm, too in control, and the flight attendant was making increasingly desperate moves that suggested she knew she was in over her head. Sir Carlos said to Terrence, "Do you have any objection to remaining in your assigned seat while we sort this out?" Terrence looked up at him with a slight smile. "None at all, officer. I'm exactly where I belong." The phrase hit Jessica like a physical blow. Exactly where I belong. It was quiet confidence backed by something she couldn't identify. Something that made her realize she might have made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to back down now. Too many people were watching, too much had been said. Too many lines had been crossed. Terrence Williams had been patient long enough. It was time to show Jessica Martinez who she was really dealing with. "Look," Jessica said, her voice rising to a pitch that carried to the back of the plane. "I don't care who you think you are or what sob story you're about to tell me. People like you don't just magically have money for first-class tickets, so either prove you belong here or get out." The words hit the cabin like a slap. The silence that followed was so complete that the aircraft's ventilation system seemed deafening. David Chen's live stream viewer count spiked past 500,000 as the clip immediately started circulating across every social media platform. "Oh my God," David whispered to his camera, his voice barely audible. "She just said it. She actually said it out loud." 500,000 people just watched the mask come completely off. Isabella Thompson's pen stopped moving across her legal pad. In 8 years of civil rights law, she'd heard discrimination expressed in countless coded ways, but rarely had she witnessed such naked prejudice, stated so clearly on record. This wasn't subtext anymore. This was evidence. Kevin Johnson felt something break inside his chest. "People like you." The phrase hit him like it had hit him at scholarship interviews, job applications, every time someone had been surprised by his presence in spaces they thought belonged to them. But this time was different. This time, dozens of witnesses were recording everything. Elena Rodriguez gasped audibly. She'd known Jessica was making a mistake, but this was career suicide. You couldn't say things like that to passengers. You couldn't say things like that to anyone. The words hung in the air like toxic gas poisoning everything they touched. Carlos Mendez, the security supervisor, felt his training kick in. He'd heard enough. This had moved beyond a passenger service issue into federal discrimination territory, and he needed to document everything carefully. His hand moved to his radio to call for additional supervisors. That was completely inappropriate, Isabella said, standing up from her seat. I'm a civil rights attorney, and what I just witnessed was explicit racial discrimination. Everyone in this cabin is a witness. And I'm documenting every word Michael Rodriguez added from seat 1D, his phone recording steadily. I write for Aviation Weekly, and this is going to be front-page news. Jessica's face went white as she realized how her words had landed. The cabin was full of cameras, full of witnesses, full of people who could destroy her career with a single video clip. That's not what I meant, she stammered. Then what did you mean? Terrence asked, his voice still calm but carrying new weight. When you said people like me, what exactly were you referring to? The question was a trap beautifully set. Any answer Jessica gave would either confirm her discrimination or reveal her inability to articulate a legitimate concern. She looked around the cabin, seeing phones pointed at her from every direction, seeing passengers who'd gone from curious to hostile. I meant people who seem suspicious, Jessica said weakly. Suspicious how Terrence pressed gently. People who don't, who aren't. Jessica struggled, realizing that any word she chose would damn her further. People who don't look like they belong in first class? Isabella offered helpfully. Jessica's silence was answer enough. Brad Coleman tried to rescue his colleague. We have procedures for verifying passenger credentials when there are irregularities. What irregularities? Carlos Mendez asked. The passenger has valid identification and a confirmed ticket. What else could you possibly need? Brad looked at Terrence, seeing his casual clothes, his unremarkable appearance, his calm demeanor that seemed to suggest he wasn't intimidated by their authority. He just doesn't seem like a typical first-class passenger. And what does a typical first-class passenger look like? David Chen asked from seat 2B. His camera capturing Brad's face as he realized he'd walked into the same trap as Jessica. The live stream chat was exploding with comments from viewers around the world. This is the most documented discrimination case ever. These flight attendants just destroyed their careers live. Someone needs to tell them they're being watched by 500K people. Plot twist coming. This passenger is more than he seems. Terrence reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Every eye in the cabin followed his hands as he scrolled through his contacts. You know, Terrence said, his voice conversational. I've been flying for over 20 years. I've been questioned, challenged, humiliated, and asked to prove my worth more times than I can count. Usually I just accept it and move on. But today feels different. He looked up at Jessica, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that made her take a step backward. It wasn't anger. It was certainty. Today, I think it's time for the assumptions to have consequences. Terrence pressed a number on his phone and put it on speaker. The dial tone echoed through the cabin as every passenger leaned forward to hear what would come next. The phone rang once, twice. Then a professional female voice answered Amanda Foster's office. This is Rachel Anderson speaking. Rachel, this is Terrence. I need you to patch me through to Amanda immediately. Yes, sir, she's standing by. The hold music lasted exactly 3 seconds before Amanda Foster's voice filled the cabin. Terrence, I've been watching the social media feeds. Are you all right? Jessica's face went from white to gray. Amanda Foster was the chairman of the board of Meridian Airlines, the most powerful person in the company hierarchy. And she was talking to the passenger Jessica had just humiliated like they were close colleagues. I'm fine, Amanda. But we have a situation here on Flight 847. I need you to listen to something. Terrence held the phone toward Jessica. Ma'am, would you mind repeating what you just said about people like me? I want to make sure our board chair heard it correctly. Jessica's mouth opened and closed without sound. She looked around the cabin wildly, seeing cameras recording her silence, seeing passengers watching her, realized she'd just challenged someone with direct access to the company's leadership. Jessica Amanda Foster's voice came through the speaker. "This is Amanda Foster, chairman of the board. Can you hear me?" "Yes. Yes, ma'am," Jessica whispered. "Can you tell me why you've been challenging Mr. Williams's right to sit in his assigned seat, Mr. Williams?" The name hit Jessica like cold water. "Not the passenger or this man or people like you. Mr. Williams. Someone the board chair knew by name. I was following verification procedures," Jessica said, her voice barely audible. "Verification procedures for what?" "For suspicious passenger activity." "And what made Mr. Williams' activity suspicious?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Every passenger in the cabin held their breath, waiting to see if Jessica would dig herself deeper or finally understand what she'd done. He just didn't seem to belong in first class," Jessica whispered. "Based on what criteria?" The silence stretched for 10 seconds. 20. 30. Jessica couldn't answer because any honest answer would confirm what everyone already knew. David Chen's viewer count hit 750,000. The live stream was being shared faster than his platform could track. News outlets were starting to pick up the story. The hashtag Meridian Airlines was trending worldwide. Elena Rodriguez watched Jessica's career end in real time. She'd tried to intervene, tried to show that the passenger's ticket was legitimate, but Jessica had been too proud to listen. Now they were all witnesses to discrimination so blatant it couldn't be denied or explained away. Kevin Johnson felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that finally someone was being held accountable for the assumptions and discrimination he'd faced his entire life. Sadness that it had taken a passenger with apparent connections to company leadership to get justice. Carlos Mendez was already mentally writing his incident report. He'd been called to handle a passenger compliance issue and instead had documented federal discrimination by airline employees. His supervisors would want every detail, every quote, every moment that led to what was clearly going to be a major lawsuit. Terrence Williams sat in seat 3A phone on speaker, waiting for Jessica's answer. 23 years ago, he'd been powerless against discrimination forced to sleep in an airport because assumptions had been allowed to override facts. But he'd built something since then. He'd gained power influence, the ability to make sure assumptions came with consequences. Jessica Amanda Foster's voice cut through the silence. "I'm going to ask you one more time. What specific criteria made you think Mr. Williams didn't belong in first class?" Jessica Martinez looked around the cabin one more time, seeing cameras, seeing witnesses, seeing her career dissolving in real time. And finally she understood who she'd been challenging. But understanding came too late. The damage was done, the words were spoken, the discrimination was documented, and Terrence Williams was just getting started. "I don't care how many people are filming," Jessica said, desperation creeping into her voice as she realized her authority was slipping away. "This is my aircraft and I decide who sits where. Security remove this passenger immediately." The words triggered an avalanche across social media. David Chen's live stream viewer count exploded past 1 million as clips of Jessica's demand went viral on every platform simultaneously. Within 60 seconds, the hashtag Remove the Passenger was trending alongside Meridian discrimination and justice for Terrence. 1 million viewers, David whispered to his camera, his voice shaking with the magnitude of what he was documenting. "We just crossed 1 million people watching this discrimination happen live. The internet is on fire." Carlos Mendez, the security supervisor, stood frozen. "Remove the passenger." He looked at Terrence Williams, who was sitting calmly in his assigned seat, holding a phone conversation with the airline's board chair. He looked at Jessica Martinez, who was demanding action that would end his own career along with hers. "Ma'am," Carlos said carefully, "I cannot remove a passenger who has valid identification, and a confirmed ticket without specific legal justification. "I'm giving you justification," Jessica snapped. "Passenger non-compliance." Non-compliance with what Isabella Thompson asked her legal training fully engaged. He's sitting in his assigned seat. He's shown his identification. He's been completely cooperative. What exactly has he failed to comply with? Brad Coleman stepped forward, his voice rising. He failed to comply with crew instructions for additional verification. Verification of what Michael Rodriguez asked from his seat. His phone recording everything. His ticket was confirmed in your registration system. What additional verification could possibly be required? The questions came faster now. Passengers who'd been silent observers becoming active challengers of the discrimination they were witnessing. "This is insane," said a woman in seat 2A. "I've been flying first class for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone ask to prove they belong here. I've never been asked for additional verification," added a businessman in seat 1B. Why is he different? The cabin was becoming a courtroom with Jessica and Brad as defendants facing a jury of their peers. Every passenger had become a witness. Every phone had become evidence. Every question had become an indictment. Amanda Foster's voice cut through the chaos from Terrence's speakerphone. "Jessica, this is a direct order. Do not have this passenger removed. Do you understand me?" "But ma'am, he's being non-compliant. He's being non-compliant with illegal demands." Amanda's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "And if security removes him based on your request, this airline will face federal charges for civil rights violations." The words hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. Federal charges. Civil rights violations. Jessica's face went from flushed to pale as she realized the legal implications of what she'd been demanding. David Chen's chat was moving so fast he couldn't read it, but the sentiment was clear. Justice. This is beautiful. Flight attendant just got owned by her own boss. Plot twist. He owns the airline, doesn't he? Elena. Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "Jessica, I tried to tell you. His ticket is legitimate. He has every right to be here. This has to stop." Jessica whirled on her colleague. "You don't get to decide." "Neither do you," Elena interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "We serve passengers. We don't judge them. We don't profile them. And we definitely don't try to have them arrested for sitting in seats they paid for." Kevin Johnson stood up from his seat, his medical student training giving him confidence to speak up. "I want everyone in this cabin to remember what we're witnessing. This is how discrimination works. Assumptions based on appearance, demands for additional verification that aren't applied equally, authority used to intimidate rather than serve." "Exactly." Isabella Thompson added her legal pad now full of notes. "We're watching a textbook case of disparate treatment based on race. The documentation is overwhelming." Captain Sandra Foster's voice crackled over Jessica's radio. "All crew members report to your stations immediately. We have a company emergency in progress." Company emergency. The words sent shockwaves through the crew members. Captain Foster had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit, watching social media explode, fielding calls from corporate headquarters, understanding that Flight 847 had become ground zero for a crisis that could destroy the airline's reputation. Terrence Williams listened to it all, watching Jessica's authority crumble, watching his fellow passengers stand up for justice, watching a crew member find her courage. But he wasn't finished yet. Amanda Terrence said into his phone, "I think it's time for full disclosure." "Are you sure?" Amanda Foster's voice was tense. "Once you reveal your position, there's no going back." "I'm sure. These passengers deserve to understand what they've been witnessing." Jessica looked at the phone with growing dread. Full disclosure. Reveal your position. The phrases suggested something much bigger than a passenger complaint. "Ladies and gentlemen," Amanda Foster's voice addressed to the entire cabin through Terrence's speakerphone. This is Amanda Foster, chairman of the board of Meridian Airlines. I want to apologize for what you've witnessed today. What you've seen is unacceptable discrimination that violates every principle our company stands for. The cabin fell silent. Even the notification sounds from phones seemed to pause as passengers absorbed the gravity of the moment. The passenger you've seen being harassed is Mr. Terrence Williams. He is the chief executive officer of Skyline Aviation Group, which owns 67% of Meridian Airlines. He is not just a passenger. He is the owner of this airline. The silence that followed was so complete it felt solid. Jessica's face went through several colors before settling on gray. Brad Coleman staggered backward as if he'd been physically struck. Captain Foster's voice crackled over the radio. "Oh, Jesus Christ." David Chen's viewer count spiked past 1.5 million as the revelation spread across the internet at light speed. The chat exploded. Plot twist of the century. He owns the airline. Those flight attendants are so fired. This is the best justice video ever. Isabella Thompson felt her pulse racing. She'd witnessed discrimination cases before, but never one where the victim had the power to ensure complete justice. This wasn't just documentation for a future lawsuit. This was justice happening in real time. Michael Rodriguez was typing frantically, updating his editorial team, breaking airline CEO racially profiled on his own airline. Live documentation. Career-ending implications for crew. Biggest aviation story of the year. Kevin Johnson sat back down heavily, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. A black CEO being discriminated against on his own airline by his own employees in front of hundreds of thousands of witnesses. It was unprecedented, terrible, and somehow perfectly representative of how bias worked, assumptions so strong they overrode common sense. Elena Rodriguez felt vindicated and terrified. She'd tried to stop this train wreck, but Jessica had been too proud to listen. Now they were all witnesses to the most documented case of workplace discrimination in aviation history. Carlos Mendez was already calculating his next moves. He'd been asked to remove an airline's CEO from his own plane based on racial profiling by company employees. His incident report would be submitted to federal authorities, the FAA, and civil rights organizations. This was career-defining territory. Jessica Martinez looked around the cabin, seeing phones pointed at her, seeing passengers who now knew exactly what she'd done. She'd challenged the owner of the airline. She'd demanded his removal from his own aircraft. She'd done it all on live video in front of 1.5 million witnesses. But Terrence Williams wasn't finished. He'd revealed his identity, but he hadn't revealed his power. And power he'd learned over 23 years of building businesses and fighting discrimination was only meaningful when it was used to protect others. Now Terrence said, his voice carrying new authority. "Let me show you what accountability looks like." "Amanda." Terrence continued, his voice filling the cabin through the speakerphone. "Please implement Crisis Protocol 7. Effective immediately." In the corporate offices of Skyline Aviation Group, Rachel Anderson was coordinating a response that would reshape how airlines handled discrimination forever. Her computer screens showed real-time social media analytics that were breaking every record the company had ever tracked. "Crisis Protocol 7 is active." Amanda Foster's voice confirmed. "All senior leadership is now monitoring this situation. Legal, PR, and operations teams are standing by." Jessica Martinez felt the world shifting beneath her feet. Crisis protocols, senior leadership monitoring. She'd started the day thinking she was enforcing company policy. Instead, she'd triggered a corporate emergency that was being watched by millions of people worldwide. Luis Ramirez, the chief operating officer, was in the crisis management center, surrounded by screens showing social media feeds, news alerts, and federal aviation monitoring systems. "Amanda," his voice joined the conference call. We're looking at potential federal investigations, civil rights violations, and the biggest PR crisis in company history." "I'm aware," Luis Amanda replied. "That's why we're implementing full transparency protocols. No cover-ups, no spin, just accountability." Captain Sandra Foster's voice crackled over the cabin intercom. "Flight attendants to your stations immediately. We have new orders from corporate leadership." Brad Coleman looked at Jessica with panic in his eyes. "What's Crisis Protocol 7? He whispered. Elena Rodriguez had heard rumors about the protocol but had never seen it implemented. "It means all normal procedures are suspended," she said quietly. "Corporate takes direct control of the situation." David Chen's live stream was being shared so rapidly that his platform's servers were struggling to keep up. Tech blogs, news outlets, and social media influencers were amplifying the story faster than traditional media could respond. 1.7 million viewers and climbing David reported to his camera. Major news networks are reaching out for licensing rights to this footage. This is becoming the most documented case of workplace discrimination in corporate history. Isabella Thompson was taking notes for what she knew would become a landmark case study. "This is unprecedented," she told the passenger next to her. "Usually discrimination happens in private, gets reported months later, and becomes a he said, she said situation. Here we have real-time documentation, multiple witnesses, and the perpetrator's own supervisor holding them accountable immediately." Michael Rodriguez was coordinating with his editorial team at Aviation Weekly, Pull the Front Page. "This story is bigger than anything we've covered this year. I'm sending video files and quotes in real time." Kevin Johnson was watching the power dynamics shift in real time. For his entire life, he'd seen discrimination happen without consequences. Authority figures would make excuses, organizations would investigate themselves and find no wrongdoing, victims would be told to move on. But here power was being used to protect rather than preserve the status quo. Carlos Mendez received a radio call from his supervisor. "Carlos, federal authorities want a complete incident report on the Flight 847 situation. Document everything. Every word, every action, every witness." "Copy that," Carlos replied, understanding that his report would likely be used in federal civil rights proceedings. "This is the most clear-cut discrimination case I've seen in 15 years. Terrence Williams stood up slowly, not in defeat, but in preparation for what came next. 23 years of building businesses, fighting discrimination, and gaining influence had led to this moment. He had the power to ensure justice, and he was going to use it. Jessica Terrence said, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "I want you to understand what's about to happen. In the next few minutes, you're going to experience consequences for discrimination. Not lawsuits that take years, not investigations that get buried, but immediate permanent consequences." Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't know who you were." "And if I had been anyone else?" Terrence asked. "If I had been a teacher, a student, a retiree, someone without power, would that have made your assumptions acceptable?" The question hit the cabin like a challenge. Jessica couldn't answer because any response would either confirm her discrimination or reveal the emptiness of her authority. That's the point Isabella Thompson said, her legal training fully engaged. Discrimination is wrong regardless of the victim's status. The only reason we're seeing justice here is because the victim had power. That's not how justice is supposed to work. Amanda Foster's voice addressed the cabin again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want every passenger on this flight to know that what you've witnessed does not represent Meridian Airlines' values. You have documented a failure of our training, our culture, and our oversight. Your videos will be used to ensure this never happens again." Elena Rodriguez felt a mixture of vindication and fear. She'd tried to stop this disaster, but Jessica had been too proud to listen. Now corporate leadership was promising to use passenger footage to reform the entire company. "Elena Rodriguez." Amanda Foster's voice called out specifically, Please identify yourself to Mr. Williams. Elena raised her hand tentatively. I'm Elena Rodriguez, ma'am. I tried to verify the passenger's ticket when I saw there was a problem. Elena Terrence said you showed more leadership in 10 minutes than some people show in their entire careers. You tried to do the right thing when it wasn't easy. Tears formed in Elena's eyes. In 8 months with the airline, she'd never felt valued or heard. Now the company owner was recognizing her courage in front of hundreds of thousands of witnesses. Brad Coleman. Amanda Foster's voice continued. Please identify yourself. Brad's hand shook as he raised it. Here, ma'am. Brad, you supported and escalated discriminatory treatment of our company owner. You demanded the removal of a passenger who had valid identification and a confirmed ticket. Do you understand the legal implications of your actions? Brad's voice cracked. Yes, ma'am. Jessica Martinez. Amanda's voice was sharp now. You initiated discriminatory treatment, escalated the situation despite multiple opportunities to de-escalate, used racial profiling to justify harassment, and demanded security. Remove a passenger based purely on bias. Do you understand that your actions constitute federal civil rights violations? Jessica couldn't speak. She nodded, understanding that her career was over, that her actions had been documented by millions of witnesses, that there would be no appeals or second chances. David Chen's audience was witnessing corporate accountability in real time. This is incredible, he whispered to his camera. We're watching a company owner hold his own employees accountable for discrimination immediately, publicly, permanently. I've never seen anything like this. The cabin had become a courtroom, a classroom, and a turning point all at once. Passengers were witnessing how power could be used for justice instead of protection, how documentation could create accountability, how standing up for what's right could change entire company cultures. But Terrence Williams wasn't finished. He'd exposed the discrimination and triggered corporate accountability. Now he was going to make sure the changes were permanent. Amanda Terrence said, initiate the Williams Protocol. The words sent shockwaves through the corporate crisis center. The Williams Protocol was theoretical, a comprehensive anti-discrimination response that would reshape how the airline industry handled bias. It had never been implemented because it had never been needed. Until now. The Williams Protocol. Amanda Foster announced to the cabin, is a comprehensive response to discrimination that goes beyond individual accountability. It means immediate termination, industry-wide blacklisting, federal investigation cooperation, and complete transparency about the incident. Jessica Martinez felt her legs give way. She gripped the seat back for support as she understood that this wasn't just about losing her job. This was about losing her career, her reputation, her future in aviation. All because she'd made assumptions about who belonged in first class. Furthermore, Amanda continued, this incident will trigger a complete review of our hiring practices, training programs, and oversight procedures. Every employee will undergo bias training. Every passenger interaction will be monitored. Every complaint will be investigated by external civil rights organizations. Luis Ramirez's voice joined the call. We're also implementing real-time bias detection technology on all flights. AI monitoring of passenger interactions, automatic flagging of discriminatory behavior, and immediate intervention protocols. David Chen's livestream had reached 2.1 million viewers with sharing rates that were crashing social media servers. This is unbelievable, he told his camera. We're watching an entire industry change in real time because of one incident of discrimination that was too well documented to ignore. Isabella Thompson was documenting everything for what she knew would become a landmark case in civil rights law. This level of immediate, comprehensive response to discrimination is unprecedented, she told the camera someone had pointed at her. Usually victims wait years for justice. Here, justice is happening in real time with millions of witnesses. Kevin Johnson felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were witnessing. He'd experienced discrimination throughout his academic career, but had never seen such immediate consequences. "This is what accountability looks like," he said to the passenger next to him. "This is what justice can be when power is used correctly." Captain Sandra Foster's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I want to personally apologize for the discrimination you've witnessed. As pilot in command, I failed to intervene when I should have. I take full responsibility for the hostile environment that was created in this cabin." The admission hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. Even the captain was accepting accountability, understanding that silence in the face of discrimination was complicity. Elena Rodriguez felt tears streaming down her face. In 8 months with Meridian Airlines, she'd never seen leadership take responsibility for anything. Now she was witnessing complete transparency and accountability from the company owner down to individual crew members. Carlos Mendez received another radio call. "Carlos, the Department of Transportation is sending investigators to meet the flight. They want to interview all witnesses and review all documentation. This is being treated as a federal civil rights incident." "Copy that." Carlos replied, understanding that his witness testimony would be part of a federal case. "We have multiple video recordings, dozens of witnesses, and clear documentation of discriminatory behavior." Terrence Williams looked around the cabin, seeing faces that had been transformed by witnessing justice happen in real time. These passengers had started the flight as strangers and were ending it as witnesses to history. "I want everyone in this cabin to understand something," Terrence said, his voice carrying to every seat. "What you witnessed today wasn't an aberration. It was discrimination made visible. This happens every day to people who don't have cameras, don't have witnesses, don't have power." His words hit the cabin with the weight of truth. Passengers who'd been entertained by the drama began to understand the deeper implications of what they'd witnessed. "Every video you've taken, every witness statement you can give, every time you share this story, you're protecting the next person who gets profiled, challenged, or told they don't belong. You're making it harder for discrimination to hide in the shadows." Michael Rodriguez was already coordinating with civil rights organizations, sending them clips and documentation. "This footage is going to be used in training programs, legal proceedings, and policy development for years," he told his editorial team. "It's the most comprehensive documentation of workplace discrimination ever captured." Amanda Foster's voice addressed the cabin one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, your flight today has been canceled. Not as punishment, but as recognition that something happened here that requires our complete attention. You'll be rebooked on the next available flights with full compensation and upgrades." The passengers didn't complain. They understood they'd been part of something bigger than transportation. They'd been witnesses to a moment when power was used for justice instead of protection. Jessica Martinez and Brad Coleman. Amanda continued, "You are terminated, effective immediately. Your credentials are revoked, your access is canceled, and you will be escorted from the aircraft by federal authorities for questioning." Jessica's legs finally gave out completely. She sank into the nearest seat, understanding that her 15-year career was over because of 30 minutes of assumptions and bias. "Captain Sandra Foster, you are suspended pending investigation. Your failure to intervene in clear discrimination will be reviewed by federal aviation authorities." The captain's voice came over the intercom one last time. "I accept full responsibility for my failure of leadership." Elena Rodriguez was shaking as she realized the magnitude of what had happened. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice barely audible. "What happens to the rest of us?" Terrence looked at her with something like pride. "Elena, you tried to stop this when you saw it was wrong. You showed courage when it wasn't easy. You have a future with this company, and I'll make sure of it." David Chen was wrapping up his live stream with an audience that had peaked at 2.3 million viewers. "This has been the most incredible documentation of justice in real time that I've ever witnessed. A CEO was discriminated against on his own airline, and instead of hiding it or covering it up, he used his power to create accountability and change. The federal authorities were already boarding the aircraft. Department of Transportation investigators, FBI civil rights specialists, and federal marshals who would escort Jessica and Brad for questioning. Isabella Thompson was organizing witness statements and video evidence for what would become a landmark federal case. This documentation will be used to establish new standards for how discrimination is handled in the aviation industry, she told the gathering investigators. Kevin Johnson was already planning to use this experience in his medical career, understanding that discrimination was a public health issue that required witness courage and institutional accountability. Carlos Mendez was completing his incident report, documenting every moment of discrimination he'd witnessed. His 15 years of security experience had never prepared him for anything this clear-cut or well-documented. As passengers began to deplane, each one understood they'd been part of something historic. They'd witnessed how discrimination worked when it was made visible how power could be used for justice when wielded correctly, and how accountability could happen immediately when enough people were willing to bear witness. Terrence Williams remained in his seat not out of stubbornness, but out of reflection. 23 years ago, he'd been powerless against discrimination, forced to sleep in an airport because assumptions had overridden facts. Today, he'd used his power to ensure that assumptions would have consequences, that discrimination would face immediate accountability, and that justice could happen in real time when enough people were willing to stand up for what was right. The transformation wasn't just personal. It was institutional, industry-wide, and permanent. The Williams Protocol was now part of federal aviation policy. The documentation would reshape how discrimination was handled across all transportation industries. The witnesses would carry the story forward, making it harder for bias to operate in darkness. But more than anything, 30 passengers had learned that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that courage was contagious, and that justice was possible when enough people were willing to demand it. Terrence Williams stood slowly, not in defeat, but in the quiet authority of someone who had just transformed an industry. The first-class cabin of Flight 847 had become the most documented civil rights moment in aviation history, and now it was time for the lessons to sink in. I want everyone in this cabin to understand something Terrence said, his voice carrying the weight of 23 years of fighting discrimination. I didn't reveal my identity to embarrass anyone or to show off my power. I revealed it because discrimination must have consequences, and those consequences must be immediate, visible, and permanent. The passengers listened with the intensity of students in the most important class of their lives. David Chen's final viewer count had reached 2.7 million before he ended the live stream, but dozens of other passengers were still recording, understanding that this moment was too important to lose. For 30 minutes you watched me be treated as less than human. Some of you filmed it, some of you spoke up, some of you stayed silent. All of you learned something today about how bias works, how it spreads, and how it can be stopped. Jessica Martinez sat slumped in a crew seat, her 15-year career destroyed by 30 minutes of assumptions she couldn't take back. Federal investigators were waiting to interview her. Her name was trending on social media, and she would never work in aviation again. But Terrence's words weren't meant to humiliate her further. They were meant to ensure her experience became a lesson for others. Jessica Terrence said, turning to face her directly, "Your assumptions about who belongs where just cost you everything." But more than that, they revealed something about our industry, our training, our culture that needs to change. Jessica looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I wasn't trying to." "I know," Terrence replied gently. "That's exactly the problem. You weren't trying to be discriminatory. You were just following patterns you'd learned, assumptions you'd absorbed, biases you didn't even recognize as bias. That's how discrimination works. It hides in what feels like common sense." Brad Coleman stood against the galley wall, shaking visibly as federal investigators documented the scene. His eagerness to support Jessica's discrimination had been captured by dozens of cameras broadcast to millions of viewers and would follow him for the rest of his career. Brad Terrence continued. Your willingness to join in without questioning revealed something about peer pressure, about how bias spreads when good people choose silence over courage. Elena Rodriguez wiped away tears as she understood the magnitude of what she'd witnessed and how her small act of courage had been vindicated. "Mr. Williams," she said, "I tried to stop it, but I didn't know how to." "Elena, you did exactly what courage looks like," Terrence interrupted. "You spoke up when it wasn't easy. You challenged authority when it was wrong. You chose principle over comfort. That's how change happens. One person at a time deciding that doing right matters more than avoiding conflict." Isabella Thompson had filled an entire legal pad with notes that would become part of federal civil rights proceedings. "This documentation will be used in courtrooms, training programs, and policy development for decades," she told the cabin. "You've all been part of creating legal precedent for how discrimination is handled in real time." Captain Sandra Foster's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, as your captain, I failed you today. I heard discrimination happening and did nothing to stop it. That failure will cost me my career, but more importantly, it will serve as a lesson for every pilot who comes after me. Leadership means intervening when you see injustice, not waiting for someone else to act." Kevin Johnson stood up, his voice shaking with emotion. "I want to say something as the other black passenger on this flight. What happened to Mr. Williams happens to people like us every day. We get questioned, challenged, told we don't belong, asked to prove ourselves in ways others never have to. The only difference today is that it was documented, witnessed, and faced immediate consequences." His words hit the cabin like truth often does. Uncomfortable but undeniable. White passengers who'd been entertained by the drama began to understand the personal cost of discrimination, the daily burden of having your presence questioned in spaces you'd paid to access. Michael Rodriguez was already coordinating with civil rights organizations, sending video evidence that would reshape how discrimination was prosecuted. "This footage shows bias in real time," he explained to the federal investigators. "Usually, we're reconstructing conversations from memory months after they happen. Here we have multiple angles, clear audio witness testimony, and corporate response, all documented as they unfolded." Carlos Mendez had completed the most detailed incident report of his 15-year career. "I've never seen discrimination this clear-cut or this well-documented," he told the federal investigators. "Every assumption, every escalation, every moment of bias is captured on video by multiple witnesses." David Chen was already working with his platform to preserve all footage for federal authorities. "This has become the most shared content in my career," he told his remaining viewers. "But more than that, it's become evidence that discrimination is real, visible, and unacceptable when enough people are willing to bear witness." Amanda Foster's voice addressed the cabin through the speakerphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed today will change how our industry operates. The Williams Protocol is now being implemented across all Meridian Airlines flights. Other airlines are already adopting similar measures. Federal authorities are developing new training requirements based on today's documentation." Luis Ramirez added, "We're creating an anonymous reporting system for passengers to document discrimination bias, training for all employees, external oversight of complaints, and real-time monitoring of passenger interactions. What happened today will never happen again on our aircraft." The federal investigators were boarding now. Department of Transportation officials, FBI civil rights specialists, and federal marshals who would escort Jessica and Brad for formal questioning. The incident had triggered federal jurisdiction because discrimination in interstate transportation was a federal crime. Mr. Williams, one of the investigators, said, "We'll need your statement for our federal investigation." "Of course," Terrence replied. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't about punishment. This is about protection. Every video, these passengers took every witness statement they give. Every time this story gets shared, it protects the next person who gets profiled. The passengers began to deplane slowly, each one understanding they'd been part of something historic. They'd witnessed discrimination made visible, justice delivered in real time, and an entire industry forced to confront its biases. Isabella Thompson was coordinating with civil rights organizations to use the footage for training purposes. This documentation shows how bias works in real time, she explained. It's the most comprehensive evidence of workplace discrimination ever captured. Elena Rodriguez was approached by Amanda Foster via phone. Elena, your courage today has earned you a promotion to our new passenger advocacy department. You'll help develop training programs to ensure this never happens again. Kevin Johnson was already planning to use this experience in his medical career, understanding that discrimination was a health issue that required institutional accountability. As the cabin emptied, Terrence Williams remained in his seat, not out of stubbornness, but out of reflection. He'd used his power to create accountability, but the real victory belonged to passengers like Elena who'd found their courage. Isabella, who'd documented everything, David, who'd shared it with the world, and Kevin, who'd demanded justice. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was institutional. The Williams Protocol was now federal policy. The documentation would reshape transportation law. The witnesses would carry the story forward, making it harder for discrimination to operate in darkness. But most importantly, 30 passengers had learned that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that courage was contagious, and that justice was possible when enough people were willing to demand it. 6 hours after Flight 847 was grounded, the reverberations were reshaping the entire aviation industry. In corporate offices across the country, airline executives were in emergency meetings reviewing their own policies and implementing changes to avoid becoming the next Meridian Airlines. The Williams Protocol had become federal policy faster than any civil rights legislation in aviation history. Amanda Foster was on a conference call with the Department of Transportation, the FAA, and civil rights organizations, outlining the comprehensive changes that would prevent discrimination from hiding in standard operating procedures. The Williams Protocol requires 4 immediate changes, Amanda announced to the industry conference call that included CEOs from every major airline. First, real-time bias detection technology on all flights. Second, anonymous passenger reporting technology. Third, external oversight of discrimination complaints. Fourth, immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior. United Airlines CEO was the first to respond. Amanda, we're implementing similar protocols across our fleet immediately. The documentation from Flight 847 is being used to retrain our entire crew force. Delta's leadership added, we're partnering with civil rights organizations to audit our passenger complaint procedures. What happened today revealed gaps in our oversight that we didn't know existed. American Airlines announced, we're implementing passenger advocacy positions on every flight crew members, specifically trained to intervene when discrimination occurs. Southwest's CEO said, our legal team is reviewing the Flight 847 footage to identify potential bias in our own procedures. This is becoming an industry-wide reckoning. In Washington, D.C., the Department of Transportation was fast-tracking new federal guidelines for discrimination prevention in transportation. The Williams Protocol was being adapted for use in airports, train stations, bus terminals, and ride-sharing services. Secretary of Transportation Maria Rodriguez held a press conference. The events on Flight 847 revealed that discrimination in transportation is not a series of isolated incidents, but a pattern of bias that requires comprehensive federal response. The Williams Protocol will become the standard for how discrimination is prevented and addressed across all transportation industries. The footage from Flight 847 was being used by the FBI's Civil Rights Division to train investigators on how to identify and document discrimination. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh told her team, "This case provides the clearest documentation of bias we've ever seen. Every assumption, every escalation, every moment of discrimination is captured with multiple camera angles and witness testimony. Civil rights organizations were using the videos for training programs across the country." Dr. Robert Chen, director of the National Civil Rights Institute, announced, "The Flight 847 documentation shows how discrimination works in real time. It's no longer he said, she said. It's completely documented bias with immediate consequences." Law schools were already incorporating the case into their civil rights curricula. Professor Maria Gonzalez at Harvard Law School told her students, "This case represents a new model for civil rights enforcement. Instead of discrimination happening in private and being reported years later, we have real-time documentation with immediate corporate accountability." Business schools were analyzing the corporate response as a model for crisis management. Professor David Kim at Wharton explained to his class, "Meridian Airlines chose transparency and accountability over damage control. Instead of hiding the problem, they used it to create comprehensive reform." Technology companies were developing bias detection software based on the Flight 847 case. AI researchers were analyzing the passenger videos to identify early warning signs of discrimination that could trigger automatic intervention. Social media platforms were creating new policies for documenting discrimination based on how the Flight 847 footage had spread. Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok were developing special protections for civil rights documentation to prevent it from being suppressed or removed. News organizations around the world were covering the story as a watershed moment in civil rights. CNN's Anderson Cooper told his viewers, "The events on Flight 847 represent the most documented case of workplace discrimination ever captured. More importantly, they show how immediate accountability is possible when bias is made visible." BBC News reported, "The Williams Protocol is being studied by transportation authorities globally as a model for preventing discrimination in travel." The comprehensive response to bias shown by Meridian Airlines is being adopted across multiple industries. Al Jazeera's coverage focused on the international implications. The Flight 847 case is being used by civil rights organizations worldwide to push for similar accountability measures. The documentation provides a template for how discrimination can be addressed immediately rather than ignored. International airlines were implementing their own versions of the Williams Protocol. Lufthansa announced bias training for all crew members based on the Flight 847 case. Air France created passenger advocacy positions modeled on Meridian's response. British Airways implemented real-time discrimination reporting applications. The hospitality industry was adapting the Williams Protocol for hotels and restaurants. Marriott International announced, "We're implementing guest advocacy training based on what we learned from the Flight 847 case." Discrimination in hospitality will face immediate consequences. Hilton Hotels added, "Our staff will undergo bias recognition training using footage from Flight 847 as case studies. Guests should never have to prove they belong in spaces they've paid to access." Restaurant chains were creating similar policies. McDonald's, Starbucks, and Chipotle all announced bias training programs based on the documentation from Flight 847. Retail companies were implementing customer advocacy policies modeled on the airline's response. Target, Walmart, and Best Buy created applications for employees to intervene when customers faced discrimination. Corporate America was conducting comprehensive audits of their customer service training. IBM, Google, and Microsoft were using the Flight 847 case to examine their own client interaction policies. Universities were implementing bias intervention training for faculty and staff based on the airline case. Harvard, Yale, and Stanford all announced programs to ensure students never faced the kind of assumptions Terrence had experienced. Medical institutions were adapting the Williams Protocol for patient care, understanding that discrimination in healthcare could be life-threatening. Johns Hopkins, announced, "We're implementing patient advocacy training based on the Flight 847 case to ensure bias never affects medical treatment." The legal profession was creating new standards for client interaction based on the airline's response to discrimination. The American Bar Association announced bias training requirements for all practicing attorneys. Banking institutions were implementing customer advocacy policies modeled on the airline case. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Chase all created applications to prevent the kind of assumptions about financial capability that had triggered the Flight 847 incident. 6 months later, the Williams Protocol had been implemented across transportation, hospitality, retail, healthcare, education, legal, and financial industries. The comprehensive response to bias shown by Meridian Airlines had become the standard for how discrimination was addressed across American business. Federal legislation was passed requiring bias training for all customer service positions, anonymous discrimination reporting applications for all industries, external oversight of bias complaints, and immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior. The Flight 847 case had become more than a single incident of discrimination. It had become the catalyst for the most comprehensive civil rights reform in decades, proving that when bias was made visible and consequences were immediate, entire industries could change overnight. Most importantly, the millions of people who had watched the discrimination happen in real time had learned that silence was complicity, courage was contagious, and justice was possible when enough people were willing to demand it. 3 months after Flight 847, Terrence Williams stood in the newly opened Meridian Airlines Civil Rights Training Center, watching flight attendants learn to recognize and interrupt bias in real time. The facility was built on the site where he'd once been denied a hotel room for not looking like their typical clientele. The irony wasn't lost on him. Mr. Williams' Elena Rodriguez approached him wearing the uniform of the airline's new passenger advocacy division. In 3 months, she'd gone from junior flight attendant to director of bias prevention, her courage on Flight 847 having earned her recognition throughout the industry. "How does it feel?" Terrence asked, gesturing toward the training session where new employees were learning to intervene when they witnessed discrimination. "Like we're finally doing what we should have been doing all along," Elena replied. "Every class includes the Flight 847 footage. New hires watch what happened, learn to recognize the warning signs, and practice intervention techniques. The training was comprehensive. Employees learned to identify bias in their own assumptions, challenge discriminatory behavior from colleagues, support passengers facing harassment, and report incidents immediately to passenger advocacy teams." Isabella Thompson had written the legal framework for the training, donating her time to ensure the program would withstand legal challenges. This training program is being copied by universities, corporations, and government agencies, she told Terrence during a visit. The Flight 847 case created a legal precedent that's reshaping how discrimination is addressed across all industries. David Chen had parlayed his documentation of the incident into a career as a civil rights content creator. His platform now focused exclusively on documenting bias and promoting accountability. "That live stream changed my entire life direction," he told Terrence. "I realized that sometimes the most important content isn't entertaining. Sometimes it's just truthful." Kevin Johnson was in his final year of medical school, having used his experience on Flight 847 to develop research on discrimination in healthcare. "Bias in medical settings can literally kill people," he explained to Terrence during a conference on healthcare equity. "The lessons from your flight are being applied to ensure patients never face assumptions that could affect their treatment." Michael Rodriguez had won a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative series on discrimination in transportation, using the Flight 847 case as the centerpiece of a broader examination of bias in American business. "Your decision to document rather than hide the discrimination created the most comprehensive evidence of workplace bias ever assembled," he told Terrence. Carlos Mendez had been promoted to Federal Aviation Security Coordinator tasked with implementing discrimination prevention protocols across all airports. The incident report from Flight 847 became the template for how discrimination is documented and addressed in federal transportation facilities, he explained. Captain Sandra Foster had lost her pilot's license but found new purpose as a speaker on leadership failure and accountability. I failed as a leader when I heard discrimination and did nothing, she told audiences at management conferences. The cost of that failure taught me that leadership means intervening when you see injustice, not waiting for someone else to act. Even Jessica Martinez had found a path to redemption working with civil rights organizations to help other companies recognize and address bias in their operations. I can't undo what I did, she told a conference on corporate discrimination. But I can help others recognize the assumptions and biases that led to my failure. The personal transformations were profound, but the institutional changes were revolutionary. The Williams Protocol had been implemented across every major airline, with discrimination incidents dropping by 89% in the first year. Anonymous reporting had increased bias documentation by 340%, suggesting that discrimination had always been widespread but rarely reported. Real-time bias detection technology was identifying problematic interactions before they escalated, triggering immediate intervention by passenger advocacy teams. The technology used voice pattern analysis, facial recognition software, and behavioral assessment to flag potential discrimination in progress. Federal oversight had created accountability that extended beyond individual companies to industry-wide standards. The Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division had grown from 12 employees to over 200, with dedicated teams monitoring bias in airlines, airports, trains, buses, and ride-sharing services. International aviation authorities were implementing their own versions of the Williams Protocol, with the International Civil Aviation Organization adopting bias prevention standards based on the Flight 847 case. The footage from the flight had been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms, becoming one of the most watched civil rights documentations in history. But more importantly, it had triggered behavioral changes in millions of viewers who'd learned to recognize and challenge bias in their own environments. Educational institutions were using the case study in curricula ranging from business ethics to civil rights law to conflict resolution. Students learned not just about discrimination, but about intervention, documentation, accountability, and the power of bearing witness. Corporate training programs across America included Flight 847 scenarios, teaching employees to recognize bias, support colleagues facing discrimination, and report incidents immediately. The case had become the gold standard for how to address workplace discrimination. The anonymized passenger testimonies from Flight 847 were being used by psychologists and sociologists to study how bias spreads, how witnesses decide whether to intervene, and how accountability affects future behavior. 1 year after the incident, Terrence Williams received a letter from a college student who'd watched the Flight 847 footage during orientation. Dear Mr. Williams, I wanted you to know that watching what happened on your flight changed how I respond to bias on campus. Last week I saw a student being questioned about whether she belonged in advanced placement classes. Instead of staying silent, I spoke up. I thought about Elena Rodriguez finding her courage, and I found mine. The assumption stopped immediately. Thank you for showing us that silence is complicity and courage is contagious. The letter was one of thousands Terrence had received from people who'd learned to recognize and challenge bias in their own environments. Teachers intervening when students faced discriminatory assumptions. Customers defending other customers who were being profiled. Employees challenging colleagues who made biased comments. The ripple effects extended far beyond transportation. Healthcare workers were intervening when patients faced discriminatory treatment. Retail employees were challenging managers who made assumptions about customer financial capability. Restaurant staff were recognizing and stopping bias in service delivery. 2 years later, the Flight 847 case had become a landmark in civil rights history, taught alongside Rosa Parks' The Freedom Riders, and other pivotal moments when individual courage created institutional change. But for Terrence Williams, the most meaningful outcome wasn't the policies, the protocols, or the legal precedents. It was the knowledge that a young black professional boarding a flight would never again have to face the assumptions he'd encountered because 30 passengers had chosen documentation over silence, courage over comfort, and justice over convenience. The transformation wasn't complete, and discrimination hadn't disappeared, but bias was no longer invisible, unchallenged, or consequence-free. The Flight 847 case had proven that when enough people were willing to bear witness, justice was not only possible, but inevitable. Standing in the Civil Rights Training Center, watching new employees learn to challenge bias and support passengers, Terrence understood that his most important business success hadn't been building companies or accumulating wealth. It had been using his power to ensure that discrimination faced immediate consequences, that courage was rewarded over silence, and that justice was delivered in real time rather than deferred to future legal proceedings. The flight had been delayed by discrimination, but it had landed safely in a world where bias-faced accountability witnesses found their courage and justice was possible when enough people chose to demand it. 6 months after Flight 847 made history, Terrence Williams walked through Meridian Airlines' newest innovation, the Civil Rights Memorial Terminal at Austin-Bergstrom International Airport. The terminal was named not for the discrimination that had occurred there, but for the justice that had followed. The memorial wall displayed messages from passengers who'd learned to challenge bias in their own lives after watching the Flight 847 footage. A college student who'd defended a classmate facing discriminatory assumptions. A restaurant customer who'd spoken up when a server profiled another diner. A hotel guest who'd intervened when staff questioned a family's right to their reservation. "Courage is contagious," read the inscription above the memorial wall, a quote from Elena Rodriguez's speech at the terminal dedication. When one person chooses justice over silence, it gives others permission to find their own courage. Elena had become the face of the new Meridian Airlines, appearing in commercials that promised passengers they would never face discrimination while traveling. Her transformation from silent crew member to civil rights advocate had inspired similar courage across the industry. The Williams Protocol had evolved beyond Meridian Airlines into federal law. The Civil Rights in Transportation Act required all airlines, trains, buses, and ride-sharing services to implement bias prevention training, anonymous reporting systems, and immediate accountability measures. Discrimination in transportation wasn't just wrong anymore. It was federally prosecuted. David Chen's documentation of Flight 847 had spawned an entire movement of civil rights content creators. Young people across the country were using social media to document bias, challenge discrimination, and hold institutions accountable. The hashtag Flight 847 Justice had been used over 10 million times to share stories of courage in the face of injustice. Isabella Thompson had argued 3 Supreme Court cases based on precedents established by the Flight 847 documentation. The real-time evidence had revolutionized civil rights law, making discrimination cases winnable with video proof rather than witness memory. The Flight 847 case proved that justice is possible when bias is made visible, she'd told the Supreme Court justices. Kevin Johnson was completing his medical residency at a hospital that implemented the Williams Protocol for patient care, ensuring that medical treatment was never affected by discriminatory assumptions. He'd become a leading voice in healthcare equity, using his Flight 847 experience to show how bias could literally cost lives. Michael Rodriguez's Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation had triggered congressional hearings on discrimination in American business. His reporting had revealed that the Flight 847 case wasn't an anomaly. It was a window into widespread bias that had previously operated without consequence. Even Jessica Martinez had found redemption through accountability. Her work with civil rights organizations helped other companies recognize and address bias before it reached the level of discrimination she'd displayed. "I can't change what I did," she told corporate training audiences, "but I can help others avoid making the same mistakes." The international impact had been profound. The European Union had implemented the Brussels Protocol based directly on the Williams Protocol, requiring bias training for all transportation workers. Asian airlines had adopted similar measures after their own discrimination incidents faced global scrutiny. The International Civil Aviation Organization had made bias prevention training mandatory for all member nations. But perhaps most importantly, the culture had shifted. Discrimination in public spaces faced immediate challenge from bystanders who'd learned to recognize bias and respond with courage. The Flight 847 case had taught millions of people that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, and that ordinary people had the power to demand justice in real time. Airlines reported a 94% reduction in discrimination complaints, not because bias had disappeared, but because the cost of discrimination, immediate termination, industry blacklisting, federal prosecution, and global public humiliation, had made it unthinkable for most employees. The technology developed from the Flight 847 case was being used in schools, hospitals, retail stores, and corporate offices to identify and interrupt bias before it escalated. AI technology could now recognize discriminatory language patterns, facial expressions indicating bias, and behavioral cues suggesting unfair treatment. Training programs based on the Flight 847 footage were mandatory in federal agencies, Fortune 500 companies, universities, and healthcare institutions. New employees learned not just what discrimination looked like, but how to intervene, how to document, and how to support victims. The legal precedents established by the case had made discrimination lawsuits more winnable, with video evidence providing the kind of proof that witness testimony alone couldn't match. Civil rights attorneys called it the Flight 847 standard, comprehensive documentation that made bias undeniable. A year later, Terrence Williams received an invitation to speak at the United Nations about using technology to prevent discrimination globally. The Flight 847 case had become an international symbol of how individual courage combined with institutional accountability could create lasting change. The flight was delayed by discrimination. Terrence told the UN Assembly, but it landed in a world where bias faces immediate consequences, where witnesses find their courage, and where justice is delivered in real time, rather than deferred to legal proceedings that may take years. The applause was sustained, but Terrence knew the real victory wasn't in the recognition. It was in the knowledge that young professionals of all backgrounds could now board airplanes, check into hotels, and enter restaurants without facing the assumptions that had defined his own journey. The Flight 847 case had proven that discrimination thrived in darkness but withered under scrutiny, that courage was indeed contagious, and that justice was possible when enough people chose to demand it. Most importantly, it had shown that power, whether corporate, social, or moral, was only meaningful when used to protect those who needed protection, to challenge institutions that enabled bias, and to create consequences for discrimination that were immediate, visible, and permanent. The new sky wasn't free of turbulence, but it was a sky where dignity wasn't reserved for first class, where respect was standard service, and where every passenger could fly knowing that bias would face immediate challenge from fellow travelers who'd learned that silence was complicity and courage was the price of justice. If this story moved you, please share it with your friends and family. Hit that like button to help this message reach more people who need to see it. Subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss stories about justice, courage, and standing up for what's right. Drop a comment sharing a time when you witnessed discrimination or when someone stood up for what was right. Because these stories matter, these voices matter, and together we can ensure that respect isn't reserved for first class. It's the standard for every seat, every flight, and every human being. Remember, the next time you witness bias, you have a choice. Document it, challenge it, support the victim, and demand accountability. Because the courage you show might be the justice someone else desperately needs. Share this video to remind others that quiet dignity combined with decisive action can change entire industries. When we stand up for what's right, we don't just protect ourselves. We protect everyone who comes after us. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we continue fighting for justice one story at a time.